Thank you, Barbara, and thank you to the organizers of the conference. The Wire, according to its creator, David Simon, has nothing in common with the average cop show on television. Swear to God, it was never a cop show. This is what he writes in his introduction to Rafael Alvarez's book, The Wire, Truth Be Told. For those who don't have it very well in mind, let me freshen up your memory. The Wire is this series about inner city poverty in Baltimore. Baltimore, a city with a primarily black population, a former industrial city now in great economic decline, plagued by drug trafficking and one of the highest crime rates in the United States. When David Simon says it was never a cop show, he doesn't mean that it's not about cops. He means that it doesn't use the same traditional narrative codes as cop shows. He refers to the genre, not to the police activity. It does indeed start with a plot revolving around police investigation, the investigation on the drug trade and the related murders, but then it unravels the ramifications of the issue onto different areas and expands the story into the different seasons, into new areas. The Wire is often considered as a sort of landmark in realism. It's often considered as an extremely realistic show. But beyond this rather obvious, blatant realism, The Wire also enjoys playing on the confusions between reality and fiction very well, very much. I will use a term that is recurrent in The Wire, which is the term the game. The game in The Wire often refers to the peril economy of drugs, and it also refers generally to the rules that preside over most of the systems, most of the institutions, and this game is generally rigged. And the term the game, I will suggest, could also apply to another economy, which is the narrative and aesthetic economy built by the series. So I will, in my presentation, consider the different sides of this game. First, I will tackle the realism of The Wire and see how the series is literally anchored in the reality of inner city poverty in Baltimore, which made it a very valid object for sociological study. And then, through a more precise case study of season 5 of The Wire, I will see the complex ambivalence of the series towards the codes of fiction. And I will try to show you how, in spite of the obvious realism of the show and a rather dark topic, The Wire never veers off into too much sordid detail or cold cynicism, notably thanks in the last season to its metafictional dimension, its capacity to question the form it uses, not in a purely intellectual or theoretical way, but in a very playful engagement with the medium. So first, the notion of realism in the genealogy or in the anatomy of The Wire. The two authors, the two creators, rather, of The Wire are David Simon and Ed Burns, and none of them were fiction people at first. Ed Burns used to be a policeman, David Simon used to be a journalist. Ed Burns, a policeman who worked then as a teacher. David Simon was a journalist in the Baltimore Sun, the local daily in Baltimore, between 1982 and 1995. And he was more and more frustrated by what journalism was becoming. And so he decided to carry out a different type of journalism, spent 1 year embedded in the homicide department of Baltimore, following the cops everywhere on their daily tasks, to the morgue, to the bar even. And after 1 year, he wrote this huge book, a nonfiction narrative, called Homicide Life on the Street, which was in itself then adapted to the screen by NBC as a TV series between 1993 and 1999. David Simon, more and more frustrated by his work as a journalist at The Sun, this was gradually detailed, if you want, towards fiction, towards television fiction, because he worked as a consultant on Homicide, the series, then as a screenwriter, then as a producer. At the same time, he continued his work as an embedded journalist, spending one time with the inhabitants of a very poor, drug-ridden corner in Baltimore, and then with Ed Burns, and then they wrote The Corner, same type of work, but on the other side, not the police, but the people who live in these areas, which then became another series, a miniseries on HBO, which this time David Simon created, and he was the showrunner for this miniseries. All of these texts, nonfiction journalism, transposed, if you want, into fiction in the case of homicide, led gradually to The Wire, which is a sort of synthesis, a sum. It would be a bit pointless to try to establish a close equivalence between the characters in The Wire and their real equivalents. David Simon felt the need to do this 2 years after the show started, because many people kept saying, oh, who is this character? Who does he correspond to? And David Simon wrote an article in The Sun in order to set things straight. And he wrote, when it comes to the characters on The Wire, there is no schematic by which real Baltimore can be paired to its HBO equivalent. Not that works anyway. Only with regard to the larger themes of the story, a drug war gone awry, institutions devouring individuals, a post-industrial city struggling against the political and socio-economic forces arrayed against it, are we trying to be careful, exacting, and in earnest? So beyond the real origins of characters and facts, the series manages a playful interaction between, or playful confusion between reality and fiction, notably by using real people as actors in secondary roles, for instance, or by choosing names of people having existed for their characters. A few examples, because there are many, many. For instance, the fictional Avon Barksdale, the kingpin in the first 3 seasons of The Wire, is inspired both by real-life kingpin Nathan Avon Bodie Barksdale, who gave him his name and who was also the subject of a docudrama later on television. But he was also inspired by another kingpin, Melvin Williams, about whom David Simon wrote when he was a journalist at the Baltimore Sun. The same Melvin Williams, who also plays one of the parts, one of the secondary roles in The Wire, a very wise and inspiring character, the Deacon. Another example would be the character of Omar Little, Obama's favorite, who was inspired by several real-life characters, one of them being Donnie Andrews, a real gangster who robbed drug dealers, like the character of Omar Little, who was arrested by Ed Burns, one of the creators of the show. Ed Burns, who then helped him for his when he was released from prison, and who hired him to play a secondary character that you can see on the bottom image next to his fictional avatar. We could go on and on and on and on. But what matters maybe more than this is how realism is part of a wider ambition, if you want, which is the ethnological ambition of the series, to talk, as David Simon explained, about the dehumanization of systems and institutions, whether they be legal or not, in urban post-industrial societies. It worked. Sociologists were the first to use The Wire in their classes, in their studies. One of the first conferences on The Wire was held in Leeds in 2009, and it was entitled The Wire as Social Science Fiction, which would be an interesting alternate genre for The Wire, not a cop show, but social science fiction. A Harvard professor, sociology professor, William Julius Wilson, was one of the first also to include it in his syllabus. And he explained that with The Wire, he could do what he couldn't do with the traditional sociological text, which is to show the interactions between all these systems, not just the problem of unemployment, the problem of drug, and the problem of education, but show how all these were connected and have the students, of course, engage with it because of the qualities of fiction. So I will suggest that even though realism is nothing radically new in police shows, there's been realism ever since the beginning of police series, like with Dragnet, Jack Webb's show in the 1950s, or his later show Adam 12 in the 1960s and 70s. They were already going to police archive to find their stories. They were already showing the paperwork and sometimes the tedious aspects of police work. Likewise, Hill Street Blues later on, or NYPD Blue, already stressed the moral ambiguities of the policeman. It was not just good versus evil. So nothing radically new maybe in The Wire, but what is new is the combination of all these factors of realism. And it can do so, as Professor Wilson implied, thanks to the scope and the duration of the serial form. It can do so also because it's so precisely documented, thanks to the personality of its creators, David Simon and Ed Burns. And because fiction helps doing something more, which is to modelize, almost in an experimental manner, phenomena that have been observed in reality and that are brought a little step further in fiction, what Grégoire Chamaillou called socio-political, almost utopian experimentations, using fiction as a lab, taking things from reality, shaking them up, and imagining where they could go. And this is what we have in season 5 of The Wire, on which I'm going to focus a little bit more now. Season 5, as all previous series, brings a new dimension, a new area to the story. Not just the police story or the political story, but also a story about the press, about the newspaper, the Baltimore Sun, which David Simon knows so well. Very brief summary. At the end of season 4, McNulty, one of the leading characters, who had disappeared a little bit from the story in season 4, comes back and accepts to go back to the special detail that is investigating the real bad guy, Marlowe Stanfield, the kingpin who is responsible for many murders. He accepts to come back because he believes in the promises of the new mayor, whose name is Carcetti, and who promises a new day, who promises that statistics will not rule the logic of the administration this time. So McNulty comes back and hopes that this detail will lead somewhere. The beginning of season 5 is an anticlimax. Things are not going well. There's a series of disillusions. The finances of the city are very, very low. There's no money, and because the money is needed elsewhere, the special detail is suspended, and the police basically is not allowed any more funds. The policemen work in horrible conditions. They haven't been paid for their overtime for a long time. They have no cars. Their cars are out of repair. And at one point, McNulty even goes to a crime scene riding a bus because he has no car. At the Baltimore Sun, we have a parallel situation. The situation is not much better. The newspaper has been bought by a large conglomerate that is doing buyout after buyout, laying off many people and generally laying off the more experienced journalists. The only obsession of the new managers is to get a prize, and it doesn't matter if you take some liberties with the truth. What is going to link the world of the journalists and the world of the police is a lie. McNulty cannot take it anymore. He's a very rebellious character who doesn't really follow chain of command generally, and he has an idea. He decides when he goes to a crime scene, a homeless guy who died apparently of natural causes, and he decides to fake a murder, to disguise this natural death as a murder, and to link it to other cases in order to invent a serial killer in Baltimore, a serial killer who kills homeless men. He hopes by this that he will catch the attention of the media and thus get the money from the mayor's office in order to secretly continue the investigation of money, bypassing, if you want, the limitations of reality. So he needs the media for this, and he will get the help of the media above his expectations because of one of the journalists, Scott Templeton, who is a sort of negative double of McNulty, who hopes, he's a very ambitious character, he hopes for a scoop, and he claims that he was called by the serial killer, and so he has a great article. So he continues the lie, if you want, without knowing that it was a lie in the first place. So themes of duplicity and compromise of principles are central here. And McNulty and Scott Templeton, the journalist, they embody what Nicolas Vieillecaz, in his chapter in this book, The Wire Reconstitution Collective, calls two different philosophies. McNulty, according to him, would be the Hegelian character who thinks that the false is a moment of truth, whereas Scott would be more a Guy Debord follower, for whom the real is just a moment in the false, and who has understood that the spectacular society or the bureaucratic society is nothing else but the realm of the false. In order to go against the limitations of reality, we thus have the need for a sort of staging of reality. And even if we identify with McNulty, we are revolted by the limitations of the police work at the time, the series constantly questions our identification with the character. The character is not really reliable. He's an alcoholic at the beginning of the series. He has a bit of simplistic reasonings. He has very random sexual sordid encounters and neglects his family. And so we are encouraged to take some distance with him. And his action is presented as in a double light. We enjoy, of course, seeing how he manufactures these facts. And at the same time, we are encouraged to take some distance, thanks notably to a series of images linked with inversion. We see how his fiction subverts reality and endangers the notion of identity. A couple of precise examples of inversions. How the policeman here becomes the murderer. McNulty has this idea when he hears that if you strangle a body just after the death, it creates the same symptoms as if the strangling had actually caused death. So he realizes that you can disguise the traces of strangling. And we see him actually strangling two bodies in very sordid scenes. And the very sober mise en scène creates trouble, creates confusion in our minds, because we do see the policeman turning into a murderer, even if the bodies, of course, are already dead. Another symbol of inversion is the change of function of the space and places in the homicide department. We've seen many scenes in this interviewing room. And there is a phenomenon of inversion. The first shot we have of McNulty, of course, he appears almost behind bars. And we see him when he's preparing his fiction and looking through his files, sitting on the right side, on the side close to the door. This is where generally the interviewer, the policeman, sits. But then when his fiction gets underway, he sits on the other side. He is brought at one point by his partner, who disapproves of him, to the interviewing room as if he were a suspect. And he sits in the suspect's seat for most of the season, and only when his fiction, and at one point he is also locked in the box accidentally, so insisting on what he may risk if his fiction is found out. He may actually go to prison and become the culprit. And only when his fiction is finally revealed and he has to face his superiors does he reintegrate the right side of the law and the right side of the table. So for most of the season, McNulty is indeed the murderer on whom he is investigating. And this creates a rather troubling sense of schizophrenia, as we see here in a scene in which he goes to Quantico, which is the behavioral analysis unit of the FBI, in which the FBI people analyze all the clues and provide a profile of the potential murderer. And this is what we have in this scene.
Conclude from a behavioral analysis of the known forensic.
Can you hear anything?
Is the following. The suspect is likely a white male in his late 20s to late 30s. He likely is not a college graduate, but feels nonetheless superior to those with advanced education. And he is likely employed in a bureaucratic entity, possibly civil service or quasi-public service, from which he feels alienated. He has a problem with authority and a deep-seated resentment of those who he feels have impeded his progress professionally. The minimized sexual activity suggests that this is not a primary motive for the killings. In fact, the bite marks on the last found victim, lacking the DNA of saliva, indicate to us possible post-mortem staging. The suspect has trouble with lasting relationships and is possibly a high-functioning alcoholic, with alcohol being utilized as a trigger in the commission of these crimes. His resentment of the homeless may stem from a personal relationship with someone who was in that cohort, or his victimization of vagrants might merely present an opportunity for him to assert his superiority and intellectual prowess. If you get more, fax it down and we can update our profile.
So So of course McNulty is recognizing himself in this. And the camera work here insists on the fact that he is trapped in his own lie. We have this, what we call a compensated zoom, which is a combination between a zoom in and a backwards tracking shot, which seems to isolate him from his surroundings, and he is literally trapped in his lie. I'm going to hurry a little bit now, showing that of course it could work as a sort of a paradigm led to the extreme in The Wire, because ever since season 1 we have had a series of parallels between the law offenders and those who enforce the laws, showing that the two institutions are alike, and here they merge through this character. But we could also see a sort of inverted mirror that shows the absurdity in which of the logic of statistics, because McNulty does more or less what the institution does as well. We know that for some years the obsession with statistics has led the authorities to require from the policemen to juke the stats in order to provide the impression that crime was going down, whereas of course reality stayed the same. And McNulty here, he follows the same inverted logics. He disguises these bodies so that he can change the category in which they are inscribed, from natural death to murder. So he shows the radical absurdity of this. So my final point will be about how it could also be seen as a metaphor for what the screenwriters and the executive producers are doing, because the policeman is constantly showed as a writer, as a screenwriter of his own fiction. The first thing you do when you suggest a script is to provide a pitch, and this is what McNulty does here. He says, there's a serial killer in Baltimore. He preys on the weakest among us. He needs to be caught after he has disguised his first murder. Implicitly, through the representation of the policeman as a screenwriter and stage director, we have also an implicit criticism of the interdependence between the police and the media, and how in order to get attention you need as much spectacular dimension in police cases as possible. And so McNulty becomes a sort of amateur screenwriter. He uses the right props when he goes to, again, add a red ribbon around the wrist of one of the bodies in order to fit him in the case. The morgue is turned into a shooting studio with what resembles projectors and a camera. I will end with his connection with his associate, which could be seen as a co-screenwriter, who encourages him to stick to the script. And I will show, if I have time, a final clip.
Shit like this actually goes to your fucking brain?
Yeah. If you don't want to listen to your partner, then listen to Lester. He has all the wisdom you need, boy.
Joke if it is. No one gives a fuck about a serial killer. Unless he's carving up some pretty co-ed or some shit. Some papers put the story in their back pages. You fucked up.
Yeah, tell him.
You know what I mean? If you want to do it right, a straight up strangle's not enough. Not if it's some vagrant. Sensationalize it. Give the killers some fucked up fantasy, something bad, real bad. It's got to grip the hearts and minds. Give people what they want from a serial killer.
Lester, what the fuck?
No, you're onto something. I only need a few weeks to pull down Marlowe Stanfield. You fly this mess right, you can give it to me. Who gives a damn if we fake a couple of murders that we're never gonna solve, huh? The dead men don't care. No one cares. But if it's gonna get the bosses to throw down enough coin to do police work...
I'm out. I'm out of here.
We gotta give your killer a name.
We have to kill again.
So you need hours and hours on The Wire to give it justice, but what I meant to show was that through this season, David Simon and Ed Burns also demonstrate their uneasiness with fiction and their sense that you always have to be cautious with the possible excesses of representation. And in this, the final season represents their absolute ideal of realism, what Nicolas Vieillecaz again explains to be an impossible aspiration on the part of Simon to fracture the image, to reveal the object itself and nothing else outside of all mediation. In short, the desire of representation without representation. At the same time, The Wire constantly acknowledges the impossibility of such a representation without representation, and the charm and the pleasures of fiction. And so I will suggest, and it's not really groundbreaking, but that this reflects the very ethical question on the part of The Wire about the film medium, the serial medium that places The Wire on the extreme opposite from reality TV. It is realistic, but it's the opposite kind of realism from reality TV. Instead of editing reality in order to make it as spectacular as possible, it uses the pleasure of fiction to lead us to question the codes of the spectacular that create our identification, and to link this to the ethical issues of representation being applied to fiction, journalism, or political communication around police work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.